Hello and welcome to my brand new brush set, Jenny's Texture Heavy Pack. So this one is a collection for 46 Procreate brushes with the watercolor effect. You can see there is a couple of pencil brushes, there's ballpoint pen brushes, which I love for line art, and in the end there's a couple of texture brushes and all sorts of knickknacks that you can use. So a couple of things first. Very first, I now have a succulent. The two other important things that you need to know when you are going to work with watercolor brushes in Procreate. Number one, you will need to use a texture. So the best watercolor brushes are only as good as the texture that's on top of it. I will just show you that by switching off the texture, and I'm going to use one of these brushes. I call it Variable Allrounder, which is one of my favorites. So let's take this color here. Yes, I would like to open layers. It already looks a bit watercolory, but it only gets its punch with the texture here. Yeah, so with the texture, without, and with. So you can clearly see the difference here. Most of these will work better than other watercolor brushes without a texture, but the texture is still something that you shouldn't just pass over. You can find this Canson Héritage texture in my shop at Etsy and also at Gumroad, where you can download it for just a couple of bucks. Or you can use any other watercolor texture for Procreate. That doesn't matter. So the other very important thing you need to know is that it's always a great idea to work with the pressure curve adjusted. So where am I? Pressure and smoothing. So if you look at the curve here, it's very, very, very steep. Normally the curve just goes as a diagonal from from bottom left to top right. And I've adjusted my pressure curve so that I don't have to apply a lot of pressure in order to use the many wonderful effects that I often use when I'm working with my watercolor brushes. So now that we've got these two important things out of the way, here's the brushes. They've got little icons that I'll explain to you now. It's the same as in my previous video. So the stack of books means the color stacks. So it builds to become darker when you add more strokes on top of each other. The brush here always means that some effect goes into place when you tilt the Apple Pencil. If you do this, you have a normal pencil stroke, and if you do this, it does the same thing that a normal pencil would do. The effect can sometimes vary, so best have a look at the explanation to see what else is happening. So Jenny's Fave pencil is already in my previous pack, Jenny's watercolor pack. That's because it's my Fave pencil and I just want it in every pack. So that's that one. And for line art, that one is fine for line art, by the way, especially for more rough watercolor. And what I love for line art is the ballpoint pen. You have a great range of pressure, of pressing down hard and then just going over very lightly. So just like any ballpoint pen. I also included a rougher ballpoint pen that looks slightly smudgy, the way an older ballpoint pen would look. Most of my brushes have one point in the slider that I recommend for using. The canvas here is pretty large. Another thing that's important to know. I usually work at around 6,000 times 4,000 pixels, so everything I do is print ready. And if you work at far smaller sizes, then these brushes may behave differently for you than they do for me. So if that happens, adjust the canvas to something like this. And then you should be absolutely fine. By the way, this is wonderful to write, the ballpoint pen. It's great. So let's have a look at the watercolor brushes, which is why you're here, I suppose. And you already saw my variable Allrounder. I really love this one. Excuse me. This one has one interesting thing built in. If you just use it with normal pressure, it looks like this, already with a nice texture in it. If you press harder, which I'm doing now, then it turns almost to white. If you go back then, without lifting the Apple Pencil, you can go darker and lighter again. So this one is very, very variable. If you want to have a gradient, for example, you can do that within one stroke. So that's a very nice one. This one is what it says on the tin. It's a detail brush that does not stack very much. So if you want to do small detail here, it will stack to this, but not beyond. And you can just detail something within or without. So this one is even softer. This one has, the previous one has quite clean edges. This one has softer edges. So you can go in with very, very soft detail work if you want to. This one is a very, very wet brush. Let's see what that looks like. Like this. It doesn't have a lot of texture in it, so it's really just very wet. And you can also use it to smudge things which you've already got in place with a little color in it too. It looks better at larger sizes, which is why the recommended size is up there. So that's the very wet brush. This one is similar, but it has a bit of an edge. It doesn't stack, which makes it very helpful for areas where you want to go in with several strokes. It pushes in some of the lighter color here if you want to do that. This one is fun. It says press for salt. Let's try that. That's very dark. Let's go for this one. If I don't press, it looks like this. If I do press, there is salt. If I lighten the pressure, hardly any salt. You can go in again, and then you can get rid of the salt, but why would you? This one's fun. Let's have a clear canvas for that. I call it random water because you cannot control the amount of water that you have. So sometimes when you just want to let the paint run free, the way you would in watercolor, you can just see what happens. It doesn't react to any pressure or non-pressure. The stroke gets larger when I press and smaller if I don't. So the pressure here is really just to adjust the size of the brush, but the lighter and darker areas here are completely random. You can see they do repeat a little, so it's a repeating pattern, but you can always go in again and dissolve some of these. But then I would recommend something like the very wet brush to dissolve that a bit more. So that was the random water one. This one is great for all kinds of backgrounds. It's an organic texture builder, and you can just pick a color. I will go very large here, and it starts building texture already with a lot of variation built in. And if you go over it again, it gets darker. To very dark. So just as you would with more or less water. So you can use this brush to create a very, very lively and organic looking background for watercolor. It mixes wonderfully with other colors. So if you have a purple here, that looks great. Here again, it stacks, so you can have very dark colors if you want to. And it looks very fascinating when you choose a lighter color. You can use smaller sizes and then just have a couple of blotches. So this one is really pretty much all you need for interesting backgrounds. So this is completely very satisfying to use. It really feels like, looks like watercolor, nearly feels like it too. So the next one, the next ones in a row here are a couple of glaze brushes. So let's have this one again. And glazing means that you will see what's underneath. So if I do a brush stroke here, but maybe in a darker color, because you can't really glaze with something light in watercolor. Let's use this one. So here you can still see the bits underneath. And I like these brushes because they look like the way water and pigment pools at the outside of a line in watercolor. So this one is very, very close to actual watercolor. The next one is the same in more exaggerated. So we have not the edged glaze, but the super edged glaze. And you will see what that means immediately. So we have a very clear dark edge here at the end. It's very important to know that whatever you do with this one, you need to plan a bit, and you can't go over the same area several times as you would with normal watercolor, because then the paint and the color stacks and gets darker and darker and doesn't look quite as good. So what I could do if I have something like this and want to dissolve the bit in the middle to pretend that the first line was still wet when I painted the second one, would be to use, probably not that one, but the very wet one at a very small size, and then go with a lighter color and then dissolve the bit here. And then you can do that. You can also go for the smudge tool. I use the smudge tool. You can see that. So if you go to the top here, we were at the super edged glaze, and if you go a bit further down, you find two blenders, mainly two blenders here, the Tendril blender and the organic blender. Hey Big blender is not a blender with a smudge tool, but it's used with the with a brush tool, but I will tell you all about this when we get to it. But for the moment, I will show you the Tendril blender in action. So let's go over this with the Tendril blender, and then you can see I can also dissolve the lines here, if that's the effect that I want. So let's go back to where we were, and that was the super edged glaze. I've got a couple more glazes. I've got very texture heavy ones that I really love. I scanned a couple of my own watercolor paintings and got the texture from them. So let's go for the ultramarine edge, and for that definitely go for an ultramarine color, ultramarine glaze, sorry. That's this one. It's got the book icon, so it stacks. It's also got the feather icon. Feather icon means that if you lighten and darken, no, if you lighten your pressure or apply more pressure, then something happens. Normally the color gets darker or lighter. So this one looks like this. It's a glazing brush, so you can see everything underneath, and obviously it stacks and gets very, very unwatercolory if you do that. So I usually try to use it just at one pass. So another one, very texture heavy with a bit of an edge. Again, maybe not use it at this bright color, but at something that'll harmonize more with this one. Yeah, so that's very nice. We've got an ultramarine one with ultramarine texture in the middle. Ultramarine texture, by the way, I call it that because the color ultramarine, the traditional French ultramarine color, has the tendency to have these wonderful blotchy parts even in evenly applied paint. So that's what I really love. That's what I often miss about digital watercolor. So we have the ultramarine edged one here. You can see quite a lot of spectacular things happening within the stroke, and the edge, of course, is what makes it very watercolory. Here the edge looks slightly wet, as if the paint underneath was still a little wet in places. So here it dissolves very slightly at the outside, which also can give you very nice effects. This one is fun. I love to use it for backgrounds. I call it Freestyle Bristle. And what it does is to give you the appearance of a bristling brush that just leaves these tendrils. You absolutely have to be careful not to go over the same area too often again, unless you want to. You can do anything you want to, of course, but this now looks as if you really let every stroke dry for about 10 minutes before putting on the next, which isn't really what watercolor does. This one I call alcohol ink. It works on the same principle, but is a lot more textured inside and reminds me a lot of alcohol ink. Now we come to a couple of effect brushes. Let's go for a bit of a background here. I'm using the random water one, maybe with a different color. And now let's go back to the fuzzy wet dissolver. It's a fuzzy wet brush that dissolves. It's great for blending without the blending tool. You've got a lot of different options to blend. So you can blend with the blending tool, of course, and there's a couple of great blending brushes in the set and also in my last ones. These ones work on the same principles. And this one, for example, works wonderfully with the brush tool, so as a kind of blending brush. This one is, again, one of my very, very favorite brushes in this set. It has a slightly ultramarine and or salty outlook to it. So this one really looks pretty spectacular when you use it as background or as a very irregular thing you're coloring in between. If you go over it again with another stroke, it adds very softly, still preserves the texture, doesn't get rid of it completely. So this one is really very, very versatile. Has nice blending effects too. So this one is very nice. The water bloom, let's do this one again with a bit of a darker color. So I can show you what the water bloom does. The water bloom looks as if you drop water into wet paint. So I will use it with a very light color. And then this happens. If you go over it a couple of times, you can see that these things shift. So you can just take which ones you use, which ones you love most. Paint a second blotch into the first one. It pushes the edges outward the same way that water painted into watercolor would. If you use it smaller, you can use just tiny little droplets, or even smaller than that. You get these darker outsides within or on the outside of these little blotches. So like pushing pigment away, which is exactly what watercolor would do. This one is great for leaf, for foliage, and so let's use something a little more greenish. So this one is great for just a fuzzy, undefined backdrop that suggests trees, bushes, and leaves. This one is the same, but a little softer, as if you painted into something that is still a little wet. So again, you can use different colors here to build up your backdrop. With a very light color, it looks as if you're dissolving this with water. So this again is also a brush that you can experiment with to see what sorts of things it can do. The tissue dab is what happens with a normal watercolor when you dab a tissue into wet paint. And that looks very much like this. So you can use, you can do clouds like that, for example. It's always a bit irregular, so you can't completely control what it does, the way that you normally can't with the tissue as well. The broken texture one is just what it says on the tin. It's a bit of a dry brush effect. You can go over it again with several strokes or just use the one. So quite interesting for texture in smaller or bigger spaces, depending on what effect you want to achieve. The Cloudy Spatter is one of the special effects brushes. I already had these in my first set. This is quite interesting because when you just paint with it, that's what happens. And if you go over the same spot again without lifting the Apple Pencil, then it gets lighter within this space. The Bloody Mess does the same thing. Let's go for red, shall we? So if you ever need to paint blood, this brush has you covered. And go over this in the middle for some washed out effect. You can just dab as well, and then you will end up with nice and bloody spatters. Messy spray works on the same principle. Go over the middle, then you can just lighten the area there. So that's very messy now. Salt buildup creates a slight salty effect, and if you repeat the stroke, then it gets more. So you can really push it very far like that. This one is one of the effect brushes of which I've done a couple, but I will put these in a different set because this was already getting far too large. This one lets you paint swirling leaves, and the leaves follow your stroke, but only a little. So it's still not quite controllable, but you will always end up with a nice windy pattern if you want to. Smaller sizes and quite bigger sizes. This one should be used on a background of some sort, so let's just paint one. And then I'm going back to Salt and Darken. Then it adds the salt, but you can see things getting quite noticeably more dark in the middle. So again, very interesting textures to be achieved there. This one is another nice little effect brush, scattered stars like this, or specks if you want them with a color. Can get very tiny here as well. And these are slightly more fuzzy, so we can use these again on a darker background. Looks a bit like snow. Very nice for freckles too. And you can also use this one, of course, with a darker color at whatever size you want them. You can see these are a lot softer than the stars. This one has a similar purpose, but with some larger specks that you can add. You can just dab them in to have a couple, or you can just put them everywhere. And the soft spray, I would use that at the larger size. Also great for making your backgrounds more interesting and making those a bit less irregular. So we come to 2 erasers. Let's have some darker color for that so you can see what these do. So here we have a bit more dark now. And the masking fluid eraser to be used with the eraser tool, obviously. At bigger sizes, you can see that it's got a slightly irregular edge like masking fluid that you just erase then. It's basically an eraser. This one is a bit more interesting. If you find that you like what you've done on principle but feel that you've gone too dark, you can use the washout eraser and just take away some of what you've done. The more often you go over it, the more you will wash it out. So similar to what you could achieve by going over your finished painting with a tissue and dissolving the paint and taking it off. It will always leave a lot of texture behind, so this isn't just any eraser tool. Now we have the big blender. That one is used with the brush tool. If I want to dissolve these edges here, I can just go over that with a blender. And then I have a nice and smooth blended area background, whichever you want. If you use it at huge sizes, then it's even smoother. At small sizes, you get some interesting effects, but not really what I am going for with watercolor. So let's blend a bit more of this. Then we come to the 2 blending tools as promised. The first one is the organic blender. This is very similar to the cauliflower blender that I have in the other set. You can push with the blending tool, you can push color pigment into adjoining spaces, or just use circling movements to to blend your spaces. This one is very similar. Both of these avoid making things too smooth. For smooth stuff you have the big blender, but I normally try not to blend very smoothly, so this one blends with a bit of interesting texture, as you can see here. So after blending, you sometimes find that all your interesting texture has mostly vanished. For example, if you have an ultramarine brush, where is it? I changed the order, so I still have to look for things. There, for example. So you have this ultramarine thing, and then, whoops, you go over it with a blender and get rid of all the nice texture. Ultramarine texture, blended, no texture. So what I'm missing here is some of this white stuff. The last brushes here, let's use some of the very last ones. This is a Tex Lightener. Let's hit it with the brush tool. I go to white or something very close to it, and then I can just brush, very gently brush the texture back in. This is a bit much now. I could just take this back a little, and then there we have some very nice texture. So this one lightens up the texture in the manner of ultramarine color and paint. This one lightens it up with a paper look. The more often you go over it, the more pronounced the effect will be. Now that's very, very starkly contrasted paper, which I would not push quite as far. If you want to darken the texture instead, you can use these 3 Tex Darkeners. They all work on the same principle. You use them with a similar color that you painted, then you have this more violet one. That's the ultramarine texture that you get the same way that ultramarine paint will pool and leave little interesting texture bits. This one will give you more of a cloudy structure. A lot more regular. I love it a lot. It gets you very, very cool, watery blotches. And here we have another granulating one. A bit like the ultramarine, but again, a lot more, a lot less regular and with a lot of interesting stuff added. The more often, again, you go over this, the sooner you will really arrive at very, very dark colors. So I would not do that for these brushes. Just use them lightly. If something has lost its texture and you just want to bring it back, if you want it even more subtle, adjust the opacity, and there you are. So this is really just for bringing back texture that you lost by smudging, for example, or by detailing. So this is great to use after everything is done and to just make sure that your painting doesn't lack interest due to too much smudging, which is something that I'm also very guilty of sometimes. So we're at the end. So I really hope you enjoyed this little walkthrough. And as always, in the set, you also find, when you buy it, you get a description of every brush. So you can, if you're the read up type, and if you want to look at these again, you can always go back to the video and try along with it to see what these brushes do for you. Have a lot of fun with it, and see you next time.